I'm going to tell you SpaceX plans to move 1 million people to Mars by 2050. Your instinct is probably to dismiss that as Elon being Elon. And honestly, that instinct isn't wrong. The timelines have slipped before. The craters are real. But there's a problem with dismissing it, because piece by piece, the things that were supposed to be impossible keep happening. The actual plan, in Elon Musk's own words, is this: build the largest rocket ever flown and make it fully reusable. Transfer hundreds of tons of liquid fuel between spacecraft in Earth orbit, a thing that has never been done at scale. Manufacture a fleet of 1,000 of these rockets and use them to transport 1 million people to Mars and establish a self-sustaining city there by around 2050. Now read that again. Not one of those things, all four, simultaneously, on private funding, faster than any government space program in history has accomplished anything remotely comparable. Each one of these pillars, on its own, would be considered the defining engineering challenge of a generation. SpaceX is treating all four as prerequisites for the same project, and the strangest part is not that the plan seems impossible. The strangest part is how much of it they have already done. Let us start with the rocket itself, because you cannot understand any of the rest of this without understanding what Starship actually is. Starship stands 121 meters tall. For context, the Statue of Liberty, including its pedestal, reaches about 93 meters. Starship is taller. It weighs approximately 5,000 tons when fully fueled. It is powered by 39 Raptor engines and produces roughly 74 meganewtons of thrust at liftoff. The Saturn V, the rocket that carried humans to the moon, and still the most iconic machine our civilization has ever built, produced about 35 meganewtons. Starship produces nearly twice that, and the plan is not just to fly it. The plan is to catch it. Both stages, the Super Heavy booster and the upper ship, are designed to return to the launch pad and be caught mid-air by a pair of enormous mechanical arms, refueled, and flown again within hours. The space shuttle was partially reusable. It took NASA from 1969 to 1981, 12 years of development at a cost of roughly $10.5 billion in 1970s money to build that partially reusable vehicle. By the end of the shuttle program, each flight cost an estimated $766 million when you account for overhead. And the orbiter required months of processing between flights, not hours. SpaceX is attempting full reuse of a vehicle 5 times heavier and twice as powerful as the shuttle, with a turnaround time measured in hours, not months. In October 2024, on the 5th integrated test flight of Starship, SpaceX caught the Super Heavy booster with those mechanical arms on the first attempt. Aerospace engineers who had spent careers in the industry described it as something they had considered essentially impossible. SpaceX did it on the first try, but the program has not been clean. 3 of the 5 Starship flights conducted in 2025 experienced partial or complete failures. 1 fuel system explosion and 1 vehicle loss together cost an estimated $500 million in hardware. The heat shield, the thousands of individual ceramic tiles that must survive re-entry from orbital velocity on a vehicle the size of a skyscraper, remains one of the hardest unsolved problems in the program. Every test flight generates data. Some of those tests generate a very large crater as well. Here's where the economics become the actual story. Falcon 9, SpaceX's partially reusable workhorse, already cut launch costs roughly 90 to 95% compared to the shuttle era, from around $54,000 per kilogram to orbit down to around $2,700. Starship targets somewhere between $100 and $200 per kilogram at the near-term scale, and potentially as low as $10 per kilogram at full theoretical production. That is a reduction of more than 500 times compared to where the industry was in the shuttle era. At $10 per kilogram, space stops being the exclusive domain of governments and billionaires. It becomes something closer to a shipping industry. And that is exactly how Musk is thinking about it. But full reusability is only the first pillar, because even a perfectly reusable Starship cannot carry enough fuel to reach the Moon or Mars in a single launch. The rocket is too heavy. The fuel fraction required for a deep space mission simply does not fit inside one vehicle. So the plan involves launching a tanker version of Starship into low Earth orbit, where it docks with a second Starship and transfers its propellant. Then another tanker arrives, and another, until the outbound vehicle is fully loaded and ready to depart for wherever it is going. This sounds manageable until you look at the numbers. For a single lunar mission, NASA's own assessments have estimated somewhere between 10 and 19 tanker flights per landing. For a Mars mission, one analysis calculated approximately 60 tanker launches required for a fleet of 5 Starships, all coordinated within a launch window of roughly 30 days, because Earth and Mars only align favorably for transfers every 26 months. Miss the window, and you wait more than 2 years for the next one. Former NASA Administrator Mike Griffin put the probability problem in front of Congress this way. If each individual Starship launch succeeds 98% of the time, which would itself be an extraordinary achievement, a mission requiring 20 refueling launches succeeds only 67% of the time overall. The mathematics of compound probability are unforgiving. You are not multiplying successes. You are multiplying failure opportunities. The technical challenges compound from there. Liquid oxygen and liquid methane, the propellant Starship uses, are cryogenic. They constantly evaporate in the heat of space. The longer a fully loaded depot sits in orbit, waiting for the next tanker, the more fuel is silently boiling away. In microgravity, these fluids do not sit at the bottom of the tank the way they would on Earth. They float in blobs. Transferring them requires a precise acceleration maneuver to settle them before the transfer lines can connect. SpaceX transferred about 10 metric tons of liquid oxygen between internal tanks on the same Starship during a test flight in March 2024. A full ship-to-ship propellant transfer between 2 separate vehicles, the actual thing the Mars plan requires, had not yet been demonstrated as of mid-2026. The gap between 10 tons transferred internally and hundreds of tons transferred between 2 vehicles docking in orbit is not a small gap. And yet, the International Space Station, the most complex structure ever assembled in orbit, took 13 nations, roughly $150 billion, and 10 years to build. That is a habitat. SpaceX is planning to assemble propellant depots in orbit repeatedly on a monthly cadence as a routine precursor to every single deep space mission. Putting it that way makes it feel different. The third pillar is the fleet. Musk has stated consistently that a self-sustaining Mars city requires 1,000 Starships and 20 years. The logic follows from the launch windows. Earth and Mars align every 26 months. Within each window, SpaceX would need to launch a batch of ships, load them in orbit through tanker operations, and dispatch them together. To transport 100,000 people per window at 100 passengers per Starship, you need 1,000 Starships ready to fly. Building 100 Starships per year, which is what that target requires, means approaching the production rates of Boeing or Airbus. Those companies took decades to build the supply chains, the workforce, and the manufacturing infrastructure capable of that volume. As of mid-2026, SpaceX has built roughly 12 integrated Starship vehicles. The math on what a Mars city actually needs is where this whole picture becomes almost vertiginous. Mars has no breathable atmosphere. The air there is 95% carbon dioxide and about 0.1% oxygen. NASA's MOXIE experiment aboard the Perseverance rover was specifically designed to prove that oxygen production from the Martian atmosphere was physically possible. Over roughly 2 years of operation, MOXIE produced a total of about 122 grams of oxygen. That is enough for a small dog to breathe for a few hours. A self-sustaining city of 1 million people needs millions of tons of oxygen per year. The gap between 122 grams and millions of tons is not an engineering detail. It is the entire problem. The Martian soil is toxic. It contains perchlorates, chemical compounds that are harmful to human biology, and it lacks the nutrients needed for agriculture. Every calorie consumed by every person in a Mars city would need to come from sealed indoor hydroponic farming. Estimates suggest roughly 365 square meters of growing area per person for food self-sufficiency. For 1 million people, that is 365 square kilometers of indoor farm on another planet. Mars has no global magnetic field. Its atmosphere is thin. The surface radiation dose is approximately 20 times higher than what humans experience on Earth and twice what astronauts aboard the International Space Station receive. Long-term exposure causes cancer, genetic damage, and neurological harm. Habitats cannot sit on the surface in any conventional sense. They need to be underground or buried under several meters of Martian regolith, built by machines that do not yet exist, using construction methods that have never been tested in that environment. The plan for rocket fuel is to produce it on Mars itself using the Sabatier reaction, combining carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere with hydrogen extracted from water ice to produce methane and water. In principle, this works. In practice, a 2024 feasibility study published in the journal Nature concluded that the Starship architecture as currently designed may not physically carry enough fuel mass for a return trip without an enormous in-situ production infrastructure on Mars first, and that the power requirements for running that infrastructure at any meaningful scale would need large-scale nuclear energy that is not currently in development for the Mars program. Self-sustaining is not a word that papers over the details. Self-sustaining means that if every Starship from Earth stopped coming tomorrow, the city survives. That means it produces its own food, its own oxygen, its own water, its own fuel, its own medicine, its own industrial materials. From a planet with no ecosystem, no breathable air, no liquid surface water, and radiation levels hostile to human biology. The word self-sustaining is doing a lot of work in that sentence. And then there is the timeline. In 2018, Musk said Dragon would land on Mars. It did not. In 2022, he said Starship would land on Mars. It did not. In early 2026, he announced that SpaceX was shifting its near-term focus to the Moon rather than Mars, because a self-sustaining lunar presence could potentially be achieved in under 10 years, whereas Mars would take 20 or more. Uncrewed Mars missions nominally remained on the 2026 manifest. They were no longer the engineering and financial 8 years is consistent. An ambitious Mars date is announced approximately 5 years out. SpaceX makes substantial but incomplete progress. The date arrives. A new target is set for the next window. The city stays at 2050. But here is what is also true, and this is the part that makes the whole thing genuinely difficult to dismiss. No one else is even attempting this. China's equivalent heavy launch vehicle, the Long March 9, is targeted for development by 2035. NASA's Space Launch System costs approximately $2 billion per flight, is not reusable, and flies at best once a year. Blue Origin successfully reached orbit for the first time in January 2025 and recovered its booster later that year, a genuine achievement, but still 5 to 10 years behind where SpaceX is today. Falcon 9 went from its first flight in 2010 to the most reliable operational rocket on Earth by 2020, with over 300 successful booster recoveries accumulated in that time. SpaceX's Starlink satellite internet constellation generated roughly $11.8 billion in revenue in 2025. That money funds Starship development directly, without Congress, without budget cycles, without political vulnerability. Each iteration of Starship incorporates lessons from the previous one. Block 3 vehicles targeting 200 tons to orbit were in development, while Block 2 was still being flight tested. The catch of a super heavy booster on the first attempt was called impossible. SpaceX did it anyway. Every time someone in traditional aerospace has said a thing cannot be done on this timeline, SpaceX has either done it or has come close enough that the dismissal sounds less credible than it did before. The plan to build a million-person city on Mars does not make sense. When you lay out each individual pillar, full reusability, orbital refueling at industrial scale, a fleet of 1,000 rockets, a city that breathes and feeds itself on a hostile world, the ambition is so far beyond what any single organization has ever attempted that calling it ambitious feels like an understatement. It is civilization-scale engineering compressed into a private company's timeline funded by satellite internet subscriptions. But neither did putting a human being on the moon make sense in 1961, when the United States did not yet have a rocket capable of reaching orbit reliably, let alone the lunar surface. The difference then was a nation betting its prestige and its treasury. The difference now is one company betting that the physics works and building enough hardware fast enough to find out. Whether SpaceX actually pulls this off, whether the timelines compress or keep slipping, Whether 1 million people one day breathe manufactured air under Martian regolith, none of that is settled. What is settled is that they are the only ones seriously trying. And that, on its own, is something history is going to have a lot to say about. If you found this video interesting, hitting the like button genuinely helps this channel reach more people who would appreciate it. And subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, because we are going to talk about what the James Webb Space Telescope found at the edge of the observable universe, something that, according to every model we had, simply should not exist.